I was on the hunt for a murder mystery, and only one of these books is that. Hi, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm doing a wrap up of all of the books I read in July, and they all happen to be thrillers. Last July I read Calla by Colin Walsh, and I really loved it. And I have this odd trait where if I read a certain kind of book at a certain time of year, when that time of year rolls around again, I am then back in the mood to read it again or read something in the same kind of genre, same kind of vibe. This happened with Throne of Glass, read Throne of Glass last February, and then, like magic, this February I ended up reading the rest of the series because I was in that mood. Last May, June, I read most of the Akatar series, and this May/June I read Court of Silver Flames. Last September I read Ninth House, and probably this September I'll read Hell's Bent, which is the sequel. And I just can't explain it. This is how I've always been, and this is how I will continue to be. Does anyone else feel this, or am I alone in this? Is it neurodivergence? Maybe. But without further ado, let's stop talking about my quirks and start talking about the books, shall we? The four books I read were Rabbit Hole, Deadly Animals, Death of a Bookseller, and Notes on an Execution. Don't worry, I'll slow down and go through them all. I think that every single one of these books was recommended to me in a TikTok, in the one TikTok by one person, can't remember who. And then, like the most easily influenced person you've ever met, I just proceeded to go and buy all of them, despite the fact that I have two massive piles of books that I've not read in my TBR already. And I'm quite proud that I've actually sat and read them all back to back this month. These could have easily vanished into the queue, but I really went on a mission and I completed that mission. So can we be proud of me for that at least? But did I succeed in my original mission of finding the perfect murder mystery to scratch that itch? Yes, but only with one of them. But that doesn't mean I didn't enjoy the rest of the books. That being said, let's start off with Rabbit Hole, a book that I really didn't enjoy, maybe because it was a bit mismarketed as a thriller. This book is about a woman whose sister went missing over 10 years ago, and her dad had been going down some Reddit rabbit holes trying to kind of solve the mystery, and then he kills himself. So this kind of opens up her curiosity again. She goes down some of her own Reddit rabbit holes, try to figure out what happened to her sister and why her dad has done this. And I thought this sounded like, there's a mystery and she might eventually solve it. But that's kind of not what this book is about. In fact, this book is kind of a critique of that idea. And multiple times it's kind of mentioned that, this is her real life and people on Reddit are treating it like entertainment. So this book was really more of a literary fiction that critiqued kind of that thesis statement, and as such it wasn't really a satisfying murder mystery at all. And I think that all would have been fine, and I think a lot of people did really like this book. The person that recommended it on TikTok raved about it, and so I went in with quite high expectations, and the expectations I had just weren't met. I expected to be a little bit more thrilled and entertained, and I ended up just quite annoyed with the protagonist, honestly. And I didn't find the journey that entertaining or meaningful or anything really. So while other people recommend this book, I can't say that I do. If you want to hear more of my thoughts on Rabbit Hole, I will be back next week with more in-depth spoilery video about it and going on a bit of a rant. Next, I read Deadly Animals by Marie Tierney, and this was the perfect murder mystery. This scratched my itch. This was my favourite read of all four of these books, and I couldn't recommend it enough. This is about a really smart 13-year-old girl named Ava, and she's quite different. She's very neurodivergent, even though that's not really explicitly mentioned, but she's got a lot of special interests. She's very smart, and she likes to go and study roadkill, so not your average 13-year-old girl. She's also very astute and observant. Like, her mum is quite a narcissistic mother. She's a little bit neglectful and acts a little bit jealous of her daughter at times. And she has this boyfriend who is a little bit toxic. He makes a lot of off-color comments that Ava picks up on really well, and she really looks out for her sisters, kind of supervises them, makes sure they're not alone with this guy because she doesn't trust him, and I think she's right to do so. He does show a lot of red flags. And it's great to see a character like Ava who's so smart, so bright, so switched on, and has a lot of good common sense as well. That being said, she does then go on to take some risks after discovering the body of a dead classmate. And we follow her and this other character, a detective, as they try to solve the mystery of who is killing these multiple young male characters. This was that perfect kind of mystery novel where you're following multiple different perspectives as they look for clues, and at the same time, you as the reader are also piecing things together and solving this mystery for yourself. And because you're following multiple different characters and perspectives, you've got a little bit more evidence than the characters that you're following, so you can actually get there a little bit ahead of them, and then you can kind of solve the mystery and then watch them as they solve it as well. You're never kind of knocked off your feet with huge reveals because it's simple enough that you can figure it out for yourself, and I managed to figure it out, but I didn't figure it out well in advance. And even once I'd figured out who the killer was, there was still a lot of other questions that kept me intrigued to the end of the novel. I also liked that at various points in the novel, there was this kind of question in my mind as to whether something a bit more supernatural was going on, and that's like the key to a good thriller for me. There was some deaths that were a little bit ritualistic or things that didn't quite make sense. It wasn't straightforward as like a human killer. But it wasn't completely ruled out either. And so that opened my mind up to a lot of other possibilities and just made for a much more entertaining read. One thing I really liked about this book, and I don't think it's a spoiler to say, is that the culprit of the murders is never excused for their behaviour and is never made into this kind of tragic character. It sort of concludes by saying that no matter what the reasons were, this person did what they did because they wanted to and because they gave in to the evil impulses that they had, even though they might have had good qualities as well. And so I don't think it falls into what Rabbit Hole or some of the other books on this list were critiquing, where they critique this idea of people glorifying thrillers or murder mysteries or true crime or serial killers. It gives you a really entertaining and thrilling murder mystery without glorifying any of the violence or any of the crimes that have been committed. And so for me, this was perfect and it's exactly what I was looking for. And it touches on a lot of things that I personally find very interesting. Don't want to say what they are because that will spoil the book. But yeah, supernatural ish, human ish. You shall see if you read it. Next, I read Death of a Bookseller by Alice Slater. And I thoroughly enjoyed this book as well, although I didn't think it was as much of a thriller. It was kind of a thriller about thrillers in a way. This book is about two booksellers, Roach and Laura. Roach is a true crime obsessed loner who despises the normies, and she likes to drink cans of dark fruit cider, and she's got, a bottle of whiteheads, and she kind of smells, and she's kind of strange, but she's a little bit of a tragic character as well. So you kind of pity her, you kind of feel sorry for her, even though she isn't the nicest and she does scorn other people quite a lot. Then we have Laura, who's this pretty, kind of stereotypical bookish girl. She's a bookseller, she's really good at her job, everybody likes her. She always dresses fashionably, she has her little literary tote bags, she's a little bit pretentious. And as we see in this novel, she has a bit of a drinking problem. And at certain points in the novel, she's a little bit hateable, just as Roach is a little bit hateable. And over the course of this novel, Roach becomes really obsessed with Laura. She thinks that they have this dark kind of impulse in common, and she becomes very delusional and starts to stalk Laura. Now, I could say more, but that would get into spoiler territory, which I don't want to do. But a big central thesis of this book is sort of exploring this idea that being a fan of true crime or a fan of serial killers is quite problematic. Roach is a big fan of serial killers and is constantly saying, I love serial killers, and she knows all of these facts about all of the different serial killers. Whereas Laura thinks it's really abhorrent, she thinks it's really sexist, and she just doesn't want anything to do with it at all. And that causes this big rift between them. And so it's quite funny that I went into all four of these books wanting something in the genre, something thrilling, something potentially about serial killers and crime, true crime, and then we are on to another book that just critiques the idea of me liking that in the first place, whilst also kind of being that. So, it got a little bit meta, but I did enjoy it. It was a good book and I would recommend it. And then last but not least, I read Notes on an Execution. And I knew this wasn't really going to be a thriller, but it does still cover thriller adjacent topics. It covers the execution of a serial killer. During this book, we follow Ansel in his last 12 hours of life because he's on death row and he's going to be executed for his crimes. So we go into it knowing that he is the murderer and the crimes have been committed, even though we don't know exactly what crimes were committed, how many, etc. And then the bulk of this book, in between these little chapters of him kind of counting down the hours to his execution, we follow the story of three women who are like tangentially involved with Ansel, our serial killer, and their stories of survival, their stories of how his crimes have impacted them, or how they might have impacted him. We see a lot of why Ansel is the way he is, why he might have committed these crimes, and this is achieved without ever glorifying him or making him into this kind of prolific serial killer. I really like that actually he was quite a dull, boring man. He was really unremarkable. He had these narcissistic tendencies where he thought he was more intelligent than he was. He was writing this philosophical theory despite the fact that he dropped out of college where he was studying philosophy. And he kind of works on this philosophical theory throughout his whole life, right up until the day of his execution. That's what the notes are about. And then it all kind of comes to nothing. And at multiple points, his professors and different characters do say that like this theory is not as smart as he thinks it is, and it's kind of just written to justify his crimes. He kind of talks about how there's multiple universes, parallel universes, where all of the decisions were different, and so there's a universe in which he didn't make the decisions that landed him on death row, and therefore is he truly evil because all possibilities were inevitable. And this is just the narcissistic ramblings of a man trying to justify actions that he can't even fully make sense of. Ansel is clearly a psychopath, and it's demonstrated pretty clearly throughout the novel. And I think psychopaths are quite often glamorized or made to look really intelligent or charismatic. And they can be, but it's usually an act. And here we don't really fall for Ansel's mask very often. We see from Ansel's point of view that it is a mask, and we also see from the woman's point of view them seeing through his mask and getting like gut feelings and intuition that he's not quite right and that they are feeling unsettled by him, which I think is true to a lot of people's experience of meeting psychopaths. At certain points, you almost pity Ansel a little bit because he struggles to feel feelings and he's quite numb because of his sociopathy. And like he does struggle with that, but at the same time, he is a murderer. And so you never feel that much pity for him. Overall, I thought it was a good book and it mirrored the themes of Death of Bookseller quite well. One kind of looks at and critiques people that glamorize sociopaths and psychopaths and serial killers, and then this looks at the psychopath himself and shows how unglamorous and uncool he really is, which I thought was good. So I think if you take all of these books together, they form quite a nice little multiple thesis statements about thrillers and true crime and serial killers as a genre of entertainment. They all have something to say. Deadly Animals a little bit less so, but they all complement each other quite well. So all in all, my little thriller binge in July was a success, I'd say. Let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them, and what you think about these broader questions about the glamorization of serial killers or true crime, about the use of true crime and murder mysteries as entertainment. And let me know if you've got any recommendations similar to Deadly Animals, a murder mystery that's maybe got some supernatural elements, that is a little bit literary, that has some great characters, but doesn't become problematic or glamorize serial killers in the way that Roach would enjoy. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye!